Right, this afternoon I'm talking to writer, journalist extraordinary, Mandy Wiener. She is one of the voices on Radio 702 out of Johannesburg, Gauteng. She does the Midday Report. She has written 5 books, nonfiction, and that's going to be really the focus of our discussion this afternoon. Mandy also comes with a lot of accolades. I'm not going to run through them because it's best if you go and check out her website for yourself. Otherwise, I'm going to be here praising her till the end of the afternoon. So Mandy, let's get to the books. 5 of them: Killing Kebble, The Whistleblowers, My Second Initiation, Behind the Door, Ministry of Crime. All very different books. Now, you're a journalist. That seems to be what you like doing, is following the news. And in your books, you've dealt with the darker side of South African society, and in some cases, the darker side of individual souls in this country. Now, what drew you, first of all, to this particular side of reporting, crime reporting effectively?
So I think I fell into it just accidentally in a way, because I started covering the Kebble case. So I was sent out to the crime scene where Brett Kebble was killed the day after he was killed. And that kind of opened the door for me. But I do think I've always had a fascination with it. You know, I think it is something that has always intrigued me. I've always read crime novels. I've always been fascinated with the kind of darker underbelly of South Africa, but just globally, looking at international criminal syndicates. And I'm just intrigued by bad guys, really, because I find them interesting. You know, that they always have, very kind of nuanced characters, and I'm always intrigued as to what motivates them. So I think that's what happened. And once I had a foot in the door, I think it was an entry point for me. And you know, the problem, Mike, is that I've also become pigeonholed in a way. So I mean, that's why I think that I have also tried to write different kinds of books to try and change that perception. But I think at the end of the day, people are always going to just associate me with being kind of bad things girl.
Well, I mean, let's face it, the Brett Kebble thing, a mining magnate who is supposed to have shot himself, killed himself. I mean, it was an extraordinary book. And it's not only the accolades that you've got, but you've done the most important thing, and that's sold thousands and thousands of copies. And just for that alone, I mean, that's an amazing achievement.
Is that the most important thing? Is it?
Absolutely, I'm afraid, yes. I think selling books is a really important thing. It says something about the books. It says they're gripping, people want to read them. And you've managed to do that, and you've done it again and again with very, very different books. Now, let's look at the first one, because that's you alone as an author. There was a lot of research that went into that. Now, I gather that most of that research probably happened during the course of your normal reporting day. Is that right?
Yeah. So what happened with that is that I'd been reporting on that story for 5 years. So I had covered the whole CDB trial. I'd covered the whole Kebble trial. And I actually only took 3 months to write Killing Kebble, which is crazy. But I could do that because I had been reporting on it. So I had all of that institutional memory already. So it was easy to do. I didn't have to go and do unique research again, although I did spend a lot of time with Mikey Schultz and with other people as well doing interviews. I did have a job as a reporter at the time, but my editor very generously gave me leave, which is an interesting point as well, because she uses it as a case study in business like research. The fact that she was willing, she gave me paid leave as a reporter to go and write a book, which is unheard of. So a lot of that research had been done in the course of my job already, which made it much easier.
Okay. Now, three months. I mean, that book is well over 100,000 words, is it not?
Yeah, I have a terrible tendency to overwrite. So, but I do write very quickly because of being a news reporter. So all of my books, and it's a terrible reputation to have with a publisher. They're always like, "Oh, don't worry, Mandy writes fast. She'll meet the deadline," which is terrifying. So I tend to overwrite. My books are always too long, but I do write them quickly.
But then also you're writing sentences that you're not going back to rewrite. So you're getting the thing down first time, which also takes.
So this is this is an interesting one, right? Because everyone's obviously got different styles. My way of writing is because I have to write quickly for radio, and I've always had a history of having to write quickly. My first draft is my draft. So I do write sentences, and I just work through from beginning to end. And it's funny because like a lot of my colleagues I've spoken to about this will sit there and they'll mull a sentence and they'll consider every word and weigh it and juggle them around and reconsider. And I do not have that approach. I'm just like, let's get this done. And I write it. But then I go back and I reread everything. But invariably, my first draft is very similar to my final draft.
Okay, and clearly you just write very easily, so that's an advantage to start with. But now you're sitting there with a pile of research, okay? Do you structure this thing before you begin writing? Have you got some plan that you're writing to?
In my head, I have kind of got like a vague idea of what I want it to look like. It kind of is organic in a way. So with all of my books, I've had a pretty good idea. I can visualize what I want it to look like ultimately. I very rarely will have a storyboard. I always think it's quite a romantic idea to have a storyboard with characters. And I don't know if you do that. Do you do that, Mike? Do you have like...
I have a messy mind.
Do you have like spider webs with ropes and pins?
No.
I always think that's quite a romantic idea to have like a wall of that happening.
So you don't. You've just got this whole thing in your head. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I've got it in my head pretty much. So with Killing Kebble and with the Vusi Piccoli book, I had kind of parallel narratives running throughout the book. So in Killing Kebble, I had Mikey's verbatim narrative. So in between chapters, there was that was coming through. So I knew that I wanted to do that and how I wanted to weave it through. And then with Piccoli, I had the story of his friend, Sizwe Kondile. So it was TRC records and interviews and me going to find the policeman who had killed him. So I told that as a parallel narrative. So in my mind, I knew exactly what I wanted that to look like. Right. But it kind of morphs.
Yeah, I'm sure it does. But now this also brings us to an interesting point, because you've got these two parallel things running. Just a bit of background for everybody. The Vusi Piccoli book is a memoir. It's his memoir, and you're writing it with him. So it's both a biography and a memoir, and you're dealing with the second story. When you're doing that, are you going from one narrative to the next, chapter by chapter, or do you write them out and then fit the two together?
I can't remember what I did, to be honest. Great question. I was also very pregnant at the time. So I'm trying to,
So you have to cope with both things. Okay.
No, it was a disaster. I was pregnant for the Vusi Piccoli book, and then I had a 10-day-old baby for my Oscar Pistorius book. I don't recommend ever doing that. So I'm trying to just remember what I did. I'm pretty sure I wrote them separately and then kind of weaved them together. If that makes sense.
It certainly does. Now, when you had the 3 months to write the first book, what was your writing day? Did you start at 5 o'clock in the morning and work through to 5 o'clock in the afternoon, or how does it go?
Yeah, so my writing style has, or just my kind of work ethos has evolved over the last 10 years because I had children. So before, when I wrote the first book, I could sit all day. I could sit for 10, 12 hours and write. I was very capable of just sitting down and writing nonstop and getting it done. And then on the third book, I had children. So I then had to deal with this other issue, which I, obviously had to attend to. So then it's changed completely. So I don't have that luxury of time anymore. So now what I have to do is find gaps in my life. So, and I was actually having this conversation yesterday with a colleague who has just finished writing a big book. And he was saying how hard it is to find time with the family to write, because you can't do that little snippet. It takes you a while to get into it. And I've had to kind of teach myself to write in half an hour or an hour segments, and then come back to it. It's very difficult to do. It makes everything a bit disjointed, but I just do not have the luxury. Otherwise, I have to write early in the morning or very late at night. But I much prefer the initial way, where you could actually just sit down. I do long for a 2-week break where I could go to a retreat and just write. That would be amazing. But it's just not a reality, unfortunately.
Okay. Now, in that, just to go back to when you did have the whole day, how many words would you do in that day?
I can't remember. I think it probably, I remember once writing for a whole weekend, from like a Friday to a Sunday night, and writing about 30,000 words in the weekend.
Really?
Yeah, I could just do it. I could just sit and just pump it out.
That's a third of the book.
Yeah.
All right,
it was like 25 to 30,000 words that I could write if I just sat and properly wrote
it. Okay. All right, let's move on to the next book, The Whistleblowers, which is a whole lot of different people, and you go and interview them. That must have taken hours and hours of interview time.
Yeah.
And then you transcribe.
So that was hours and hours of interview time, and you have to spend a lot of time with people, and also their stories are very, very heavy, so you can't parachute in and out again. So that was very time consuming, and I have learned a very important lesson over time, and that is to not transcribe your own interviews when you are writing books.
Okay.
So in the beginning, I used to transcribe, and then I realized that it just took a lot of time. So now I don't transcribe my own interviews. I make sure that's, and it's a luxury. Look, not everybody's afforded that luxury. I do acknowledge that. But I've always said to my publishers that there has to be a budget for transcription. And funny enough, I've made this recommendation to some of my colleagues, and they say it's the best thing, because it's quite mind-numbing to sit and interview someone and then have to listen back and transcribe it all. So I'm busy helping someone at the moment write their book, and it's literally been about 50 hours, if not more, of sitting with someone. And if I had to sit and transcribe all of that, it would just be, I just wouldn't have the capacity. Yeah. So what I do is that I get the transcription, and then from the transcription I mold it into the narrative, into the story.
Now, transcriptions, people never talk the way that you need them in writing. So you've got sentences that don't make sense. You've got thoughts going from one thing to the next. Do you manipulate that transcription?
It depends on the circumstance. So if it's somebody's book, then yes, you do manipulate the transcription in order to make it. But I also don't want to lose the authenticity of someone's voice. Yeah. So I don't like to change it too much. I like to keep it quite raw. So in the initial books, I think the big selling point of Killing Kebble and what people loved about it was the authenticity of Mikey's voice. That was verbatim, with all the swearing and all that. Everyone says you could actually hear him speaking the way that he spoke. So I think it's important to not change it too much. You've got to keep that authenticity. You've got to keep it quite raw.
But that requires you to understand what the voice sounds like in order to take out the words that make it very difficult for the reader to comprehend.
Yes. Yeah. And I think it's a balance. So you've got to know, you've got to take out the irritating stuff as well. Like I remember with Mikey, I think there were 1,000 like you knows. So like I would take out the you knows, but still keep the fucks, basically.
of which there were 1,000 as well.
Exactly.
Do you have to go back and okay that transcription or your version of the transcription with the person that you interviewed?
Yeah, so my principle has always been that I would let people, at the very least, see where they were quoted in the book. And I think that has been the reason I've been able to kind of get away with what I've been able to get away with, is because I've always let people have full sight of wherever they are interviewed. I won't allow them to change it. So they can change their quotes, but I won't allow them to change my interpretation of it or my kind of sentiment that I'm trying to relay.
All right, but you're allowing them to change their quotes, even though they may radically alter their opinion?
It's never happened, really. Sometimes, on
They're
reflection, they'll go, on reflection, they'll go, oh, I probably shouldn't say that, I'll get into trouble, or so this person will be upset with me. And I'm quite reasonable about that, it's not worth it. Okay. I'd rather,
Yeah, so that's negotiable, that kind of thing.
Yes.
All right. Did you have to do much of that with the whistleblowers, or was it fairly easy from that point of view?
Oh, yes and no. Some chapters were easier than others. So I would send, every whistleblower got sent their chapter, and then they would go through it. I mean, the one, and she won't mind me saying it, like Rosemary Hunter is a lawyer, and it literally came back like a lawyer's draft document that had been marked up with 1,000 red comments and changes. And I just phoned her up and I said, this is not happening. Like, she wanted every single thing to be changed. And even the way that my favorite is when people then edit my writing.
Yes.
So I mean, I ignore some of that stuff. Some of them are easy. Some of them are just like, yeah, that's fine. No problem. Go for it.
Now, how long did that book take you to, from the start of the interviews to the end of the writing?
Long. It took me long. It took me about 2 years to do, and largely because it happened during lockdown, a lot of it. And I was homeschooling kids and working, and it was a nightmare. So as every book's got a story about a stage in my life that was, some other thing that was happening. But the reason that took so long also was because of the time it took. So I had to spend time with every single whistleblower and then research that story. It was, in a way, it was like doing 12 separate books, because each story had so many intricacies, and then you have to speak to people for each chapter. So it took a very long time, and it was very, very draining. Every story was just heavy, and there was a lot of it was very emotional for a lot of people. So I felt like after that I was completely drained. It did take a long time to do.
Do you have a break after the books, or do you go straight into thinking about the next one?
Oh no, I spent about a year going, oh my God, I'll never write a book again. And then my husband goes, yeah, whatever. My publisher goes, and then I start getting restless after about a year and thinking, oh, I better do something. The problem is, after the whistleblowers, I really struggled with an idea. Like, I really struggled to kind of think about what to write.
Yeah.
So the other problem in South Africa is that there's so much to write about. So how do you pick your topic? And also, I don't have the appetites that I used to have when I was younger to write about bad things, that could risk my life in some way. I know people don't want to hear that because they think, oh, you've got to write about this and about that. But I just don't have the appetite to do that anymore.
Well, I mean, you've put yourself out on the line in many of the books. So, I mean, have you had death threats as well?
Not like legitimate death threats, if I can put it like that. With the first one, I got like a SMS from a Hell's Angel telling me, some nonsense about something, but it was never anything that, although Jacques Poe always says, no one's going to message you to tell you that they're going to kill you. So, which is a good point, right? But I've never felt like anyone has been so aggrieved by what I've written that they are going to try and kill me.
Okay, so you've not felt pressured in any way. Yeah.
No, I don't think so.
No. All right. Now let's on my second initiation with V.C. Piccoli, who was head of the National Prosecuting Authority. I mean, here's a heavy, high-powered guy that you got involved. How did that come about? How did that relationship start? And then the decision to help him with his memoir.
So I first met him when I was covering. So I wrote the Killing Cable, which covered the Celebi book. And then I covered the Ginwala inquiry as a reporter, which was the inquiry into V.C. Piccoli's fitness to hold office. And I developed quite a good relationship with his lawyer and with him as well. So I had got to know him, and I had said to him a few times, oh, you should think about doing a book, you should do a book. And he was very non-committal. And then once he had made an agreement that he was going to leave office, he decided that he wanted to do a book. I can't remember how it happened. If he reached out, I think he reached out. I'd reached out to him initially saying, do you want to do a book? And then he was thinking about it. And then he came back to me and said, yes, let's do it. And it was very different for me. I think people were quite surprised by it because it was different to Killing Cable. So everybody wanted another kind of Killing Cable story. So this was me trying to do something different. Yeah. But the reception was good because he's got an interesting story to tell. And he's, we did these incredible events in the Eastern Cape with the Daily Dispatch, where there were like 2,000 people packed into halls coming to listen to him. And you know what it's like at a book event. If you get 20 people, you're excited. So it was quite something to get that kind of response. And he was very honest in the book about the experience. And at that time, it was very, very topical. So I think it worked well.
And was he easy to work with? I mean, did you have to rewrite his text for him? How did that go?
Oh, no, I wrote the whole book.
The whole thing. Okay. Was it based on interviews then?
Yeah. So I interviewed him, but I wrote everything. He didn't write any of it.
So it was a ghost job, in other words.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because we decided that we'd both be co-authors. Maybe in retrospect, we should have done that differently, because he didn't actually write the book. There was no. He talked the book, I suppose, and I wrote it. I think people thought that I'd only written the chapters on Sizwe Kondile, but I actually wrote the whole book. Whereas with Barry Bateman,
first person. The other chapters are first person,
exactly, and whereas with Barry Bateman, it was completely different. On the Oscar Pistorius book, he wrote half and I wrote half, and then we each looked over and reworked each other's chapters. So we both pretty much touched every single word of the book.
All right, so let's just get on to that one then. How did you decide which part you were going to write and which part he was going to write of the Pistorius book?
So we literally sat down and drew up a list of chapters and said, okay, you do these and I'll do these. And that's how we did it. So he was, because he was sitting in court, he was very strong on a lot of the evidence related stuff, a lot of the technical stuff. Whereas I did more of the interviews with people and more of the color around it and more of the kind of analytical stuff. And that's how we broke it up. But we both, we sat together a lot and worked on things together and looked at each other's stuff a lot together. It was very much a co-author job.
Yes, you said you sat down and created a list of chapters. I mean, so you had a structure to this book when you started writing.
Yes, to that one we did. We very much had a structure, but it also was double the size that it was supposed to be because of all the evidence. So it was a very, very thick book. The word count was far too high because we had started with a structure, but then as the evidence was led in court, because we literally started writing that book just before the trial started.
Yeah.
So as evidence was led, then it kind of grew and grew and grew.
Mm-hmm. Which leads you to a problem, because what happens at the end of the trial? I mean, did you go straight into publication at that point?
Yeah, so this is a quite a contentious issue, because it's always the debate when to publish. Do you wait for judgment, or do you wait for an appeal or the judgment on the appeal? And we decided to publish. We waited for the judgment and then we published. We didn't wait for the appeal because we didn't know how long it would take. And also there was a mad scramble going on around the world to get your book out first. There were, I think, 3 separate books that were all coming out at the same time. And the thinking was whoever gets to market first will get the market. So there was a lot of pressure for us to get the book done very quickly. So we decided to publish after judgment.
Okay. And what was that like, writing history as it occurred? Because, I mean, effectively, you're an historian, just the histories today.
Yeah, I mean, it was obviously very contemporaneous, right? Because it was like instant. But remember, this trial was like nothing we had ever experienced before. It was toxic. It was overexposed. Everybody had an opinion. Everybody could watch the whole thing. So it was the worst story to cover, the worst story to write about. All the players were difficult. A lot of people wanted to be paid for interviews, which we refused to do. A lot of people you wouldn't expect wanted to be paid. The whole experience was horrible. It was really horrible. It was nice to write a book about a case that had that kind of exposure in a way, because it was global. So the book was published in the UK, it was published in the US, but the actual story and writing about it was terrible.
Were you having to go back and recraft chapters as things went on, or not?
Yeah, we were a bit. Definitely. So there was lots of last minute edits and changing things, and based on the evidence and then based on the judgment, and then having to include that. So it was pretty much a last minute scramble to get it out.
All right. Now, it was published everywhere, as you've just said. Who were your primary publishers here in South Africa, or was this a commission from outside?
In South Africa. So primarily it was published through South Africa, and then it was picked up by publishers in the UK and the US. But so the thing was also that it was commissioned beforehand. So we knew before that we were writing for a UK and a US market also. So there were some changes to the text. There was a US version and a UK version. It had a different title in the US, a different cover for that market. I think it was called One Tragic Night in the US. Yeah.
Okay. Were you aware of having to write a slightly different language as well to cater for those two markets? Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, there were a lot of things that had to be explained because it was an international market. So we couldn't just assume that people knew, what the scorpions were or something like that.
Okay. Now, did you come up with the idea, or did the publishers come to you and say, we need this book?
It was a bit of a joint effort. So remember that first week after Reeva Steenkamp was killed, it was just mayhem. We were, for that 48 hours afterwards, we were picking up the phone and putting the phone down, doing constant interviews with CNN and Sky and BBC. There was just massive interest. So within like a week, I was speaking to my publishers about potentially doing a book. I wasn't sure that I was necessarily the right person to do it. I think, Barry had been on the story from as soon as it broke. So I thought it would be best to do it with him. I didn't think it was right for me to just jump in and do a book on the story that I hadn't been covering. So it did happen very, very quickly after the actual incident had happened.
Yeah. No, I mean, by that stage, you had a very good relationship with your publishers, no doubt. Let's just go back to Killing Cable. Did you go to them with that idea, or was that a mutual decision as well?
Um, I mean, this experience is just not, it's not normal. So I wouldn't like your students to hear the story because it's unrealistic in many, many ways. But what happened was I was 29. I had never written anything in my life except one magazine article. Literally. I was a radio reporter, and I had been reporting on the elite bouncers and what was going on with extortion in Joburg. And I went to Jenny Chris Williams because she was on 702 at the time. And I said, I think I want to write a book about elite. And she sent me to a publisher. And I went to meet the publisher, and the story was, the whole idea was a bit half-baked on my part. And they said, come back to us when you've got a better idea of what you're doing. So I left it. And then I started reporting on the cable thing and Salibi, and a couple of years later, and I'd convinced Mikey to speak to me for a book. I always had this idea that I wanted to write a book. So I went back to Jenny, and Jenny sent me to a different publisher. And I met with Terry Morris from Pan Macmillan at Tasha's. And I said, I want to write a book. And I showed her the one magazine article that I'd written for Marie Claire. And she gave me a book deal, which is insane. Like, she just said, okay, sure. And I didn't know what I was doing. I was completely naive. I had no idea how to write a book. The biggest blessing was my ignorance, because I could just do whatever I wanted to do. I could be creative. I could write what I want. I just thought, like, let's wing it. I wrote the book. I delivered the manuscript. It got published. I mean, if I look back and read it now, I do think that I got away with a lot. It was a bit rough. I would do things a lot more differently now, a decade and a bit later. But I was just bloody lucky that Terry gave me a book deal. I do think you make your own luck. It was like a bit of chutzpah, where I thought, I can write a book. Why couldn't I write a book? So it just happened. And not everybody has that experience. Some people get turned away dozens and dozens of times. So I realized that, and I'm very grateful for it as well.
Mm. But even so, I mean, you still sat down and 3 months later were finished.
Yeah, I had nothing else to do.
Okay, so with the next books, did you go to the publisher? Did you go to Pan Macmillan and say, okay, I now want to do this, and I want to do that? Is that how that all worked?
Yeah, it's kind of like, look, there've been lots of other ideas that I've taken to them as well, and they've said no. So there have been some ideas and I also do a lot of commissioning now for Pan Macmillan as well. So I'll take them authors and I'll take them book ideas, and they'll say, yeah, maybe you should work on this one, or maybe this isn't one for you. There's quite a few that I've taken them where they've said, no, I don't think that you should work on this necessarily. But sometimes it's kind of a brainstorm. So with Piccoli, I brought him with Ministry of Crime. That was them saying you should do something, and me saying I think I should do a book on Kreitzer and the whole kind of criminal underworld, which kind of was a sequel to Killing Cable in many ways. But I think it works both ways. Sometimes they'll pitch something to me and say, why don't you do this? And I'll say, nah.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of both.
Do they then want an outline from you, or do they just say, go away and do it?
They try. Their favorite thing is trying to get me to write a proposal, which I'm very bad at. So I'll have the idea and the concept, but I'm very, very bad at writing a pitch, like a proposal. I'm just not good at it at all. So it's quite a joke, because I will send off a one-page pitch that I've thrown together and say, yeah, let's do a book on this, and they'll go, okay. They know that they'll get the book in the end, but my proposals are particularly poor.
Okay. Do they set you a deadline? I mean, are you writing to deadlines all the time?
Yes and no. hate deadlines. I really hate them. But they are necessary. Otherwise, the books will just never get delivered. So I don't usually have short deadlines. So I don't have clear deadlines on having to deliver 3 chapters by this date. It's kind of like, we need to get the book published in November. You need to make sure you've got a manuscript. So.
Okay, so you deliver the entire manuscript. You're not doing this piecemeal.
It's been different for every book, actually.
Okay.
So I think it just depends on the circumstances as well. So the book I'm writing at the moment, I should have been finished probably a month ago, and I'm not. So I gave the first half, and now this week I'm going to give the second half of the book. In the past, I've done it chapter by chapter. I've done a full manuscript. Kind of just whatever works best for that particular structure of the book.
Okay, so now, Mandy, you've missed the deadline for this one. Have you missed the deadlines for any of the others?
Deadlines are like fluid, right? They're just suggestions. Yes. The books have always been published on time. So, right. I also think that publishers give you deadlines to make you panic, but their deadlines are actually further back. So I don't worry too much about missing them. But if my publisher watches this, then, I never said that.
Okay. When you've got a deadline that is, say, next July, would you start writing that book now, or would you wait until March?
No, I would start now. Definitely. Yeah, absolutely. I'd rather get it done.
There's a discipline that you put into it.
Yeah. So I'm very, very self-disciplined. So I would write a little bit every day. So for Ministry of Crime, I did a lot of that. I started early, and I would write a bit every day. I don't want to put myself under that kind of pressure. But it's also finding the right headspace, and the right time. And I like to try and do as many interviews as possible first before I start writing, though. I do like to try and get the interviews done so that you know what you're working with, and then do the interviews rather than writing and then interviewing and trying to fill stuff in.
Okay. Now let's get to that wonderful part when the book is printed and you get your first copy. Were you thrilled by that?
Yeah, there's nothing better. Come on, Mark.
It's still like that?
It's amazing. Absolutely. It's very surreal to see a book with your name on it. It's an incredible experience, and it doesn't get old for me. Does it get old for you?
I'm not going to answer that question.
Okay. Come on, don't be so grumpy, old man. No, I definitely think it's an unbelievable thing I think I've always just loved books, and I've loved bookshops, and I've loved reading books, and it's always had that glamour to it and that romantic appeal. So for me to walk into if I walk into a bookshop and see my books, it's I'll never get tired of that feeling. It makes it worth it, because writing a book, and especially a nonfiction book, is exhausting. You put so much of yourself into it. It's so taxing. And that last section to go through the edits and the up and down, and by that point you are done, you're over it. And when the book comes out and you see it, you forget all of that, and it makes it all worthwhile. Totally.
Yeah. Okay. And then when you're faced with journalists and you're being interviewed about your book, how does that go down? Are you quite happy and cool about that sort of thing?
I don't mind it. I think I've just gotten used to it. I don't particularly enjoy it. And I find that I do get into kind of a routine of giving standard answers. about things. Sometimes you'll have a different interview. It's incredible the amount of people that interview you without reading the book, and you can always tell. Like, it's my favorite game to play. And the irony, of course, is that I do a book interview every week on radio, and I always try and read the books, but I don't always get there. I know there's some journalists that won't interview authors if they haven't read the book, but I can always tell when somebody hasn't read it.
And when that happens, what do you do? Do you make up for their lapse?
Oh yeah. I'm not one of those people that will have a little hissy fit and storm out and complain at all. But I just kind of, I'm amused by it. But yeah, I kind of always know what I want to say and what the kind of key messages that you want to get across in the interview anyway. But it's hard for me. I don't like being interviewed. Because I'm so used to interviewing that I don't really enjoy it. But it goes, you have to do it. I've been very, very fortunate that I've got a lot of publicity for a lot of my books. And I will never, I always feel like I can never say no to an interview. A lot of authors are just desperate to get any coverage. So I'm extremely grateful that I get that kind of response.
So you don't turn down anything?
I try not to, no. I spend a lot of time answering questions for some obscure magazine. I just think any publicity for a book is great publicity. For the whistleblowers, I did tons and tons and tons of interviews because I was very fortunate that it was kind of prescient. So I'd written about it before it became very topical. It was before the State Capture Commission and before Babita Deokaran was killed. So the book came out in lockdown. It didn't sell very well, relative terms. And then I did a fortune of interviews afterwards, and that didn't necessarily translate into sales either. But I still wanted to do the interviews because of the topic, and because of the advocacy around that. So, sometimes doing all the interviews also doesn't necessarily translate into sales. Sometimes it doesn't work.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question: does it actually work? Does it actually promote the book in the end?
So I think interviews work better than book fairs and book events. I find that you don't necessarily sell lots of books at book festivals, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But more mass media stuff, I think, raises awareness of a book.
You wouldn't turn down a book festival then, would you?
No, I don't know.
There's hesitancy there.
My thinking on this has evolved over the past few years. I think that it depends on which book festival. So I do find that some book festivals have not transformed and they have not evolved. So yeah, I think it's a lot can be done in that perspective.
When you say evolved and transformed, what do you mean by that?
Well, Mike, it means that largely in the audience is old white people.
Like me, you mean?
Yeah. So it depends. I like to do different things as well, and I think that's there's a lot. I find that a lot more interviews I'm doing now around the book on Twitter. So you see a lot more Twitter interviews, a lot more webinars, obviously because of COVID. So I think that they've got their pros and their cons.
And how do you find panel discussions? Do you enjoy them when you're up on the stage there?
So sometimes the organizers put a lot of thought into it and it makes sense. And you're with great people who are like-minded and the topics are good and they're clever. The topics, are clever. So and sometimes they'll go, I need to put this person on a panel, but I don't know where to put them. Let me try and slot them in here. And there'll be a complete disconnect. So I find that quite difficult. And also you need to have a great moderator. So if you have a great moderator, then it makes a big difference that you can speak to the issues. But I do find that a lot of the panel discussions aren't necessarily about the book; they're rather just about current affairs generally. Yeah.
Okay. Now, you've done all this nonfiction. You've recorded the country's history over the last 10 years. Have you thought about moving into another sort of book, a memoir, for argument's sake, or even that dreaded topic fiction?
A memoir I'm not interested in at all because I've got a terrible memory. So I actually just can't remember half the stuff I've done or the detail around it unless I write it down straight away. So I don't think I could ever write a memoir in good confidence, knowing that I'm telling the truth. I have seriously thought about fiction. I've always wanted to write fiction. I just don't think I'd be particularly good at it. So Dion Mayo once said to me that if he had to take the storyline of one of my books, of one of my nonfiction books, and used it as the plot of one of his novels, no one would believe him. It wouldn't be believable. So this is the problem in South Africa, is that we are living a fiction all the time, and the news cycle is crazy. You can't make it up. So it does make me think that I'm not sure that fiction would match it. I'm not sure I'd be particularly good at it. So I haven't tried. I've thought about trying, and also I suppose part of it is ego in a way, because nonfiction sells better than fiction.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I'm willing to write a book that's going to sell a couple of 100 copies. I don't know. Is that wrong?
No, not at all, not at all. And I think you're wise to stick with nonfiction. And I think Dion is absolutely right. If you put the stuff that happens in this country into a novel, people will throw it away.
But I love the idea of it. And also, the more that I am becoming risk averse, the more I would rather deal with fictional bad guys than real bad guys.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense. Yeah. So I do think it's something I'd like to try, but you'll have to teach me first.
All right. And what are you working on now? Is this public knowledge yet or not?
No, not yet. It's completely different. I'm writing someone's book for them. It is coming out in the next 2 months, so you'll know about it soon. But it's something completely different to what I've done in the past. It's related to sport, actually. So a bit of a kind of sport memoir. Biography, really. So it is a bit different. But it was also just something for me to do. I wasn't ready. I didn't have the capacity after Whistleblowers to take on a big investigative project or writing a big book. So I wanted to just do something. And it was an interesting story to tell, something that was a bit different.
Yeah. Now, Mandy, I mean, you've done all these different things. Is it quite easy for you to flip from doing your own book to ghosting somebody else's to working with another writer? I mean, you seem amazingly adaptable for all this.
So there've been lessons in all of them. I tend to forget the lessons, which is not ideal, and then I go and do it again, and then learn again. But I like having that different experience because I think I do get bored quite easily. So so sometimes somebody's story will just capture me, and I'll find it really, really intriguing, and I'll want to write their book or tell their story. And I think that's how I just kind of find myself in these positions to write different things. And then sometimes I'll just think, I really want to do a book on this other topic. And I suppose I am adaptable. But I do think that maybe I am better at something than others. And it is good. It's always good to stick to your niche, at what you're good at, because that's what your audience wants from you. They don't necessarily want you to diversify. And that's what I've found is that people always say to me, when you're writing another book, and they don't want me to write a book about some other random sport person. They want me to write a book about what I write books about. I know that.
Yeah.
But I'll get there.
But that's fair enough. Now, The last question before you can go off to go home. How do you manage to be wife, mother, reporter, and writer?
It's very hard. So like the hardest job in the world is to actually manage to do everything. So I juggle a lot. So I do a radio show every day, but I've just come back now from schlepping my kids to extramurals. And what I really should be doing is writing the last chapter, literally the last chapter of the book that I have to deliver, which I've been putting off. So I'll probably do it at 10 o'clock tonight. So it's about time management more than anything else. You have to set yourself, although the publisher doesn't set me deadlines, I do set myself small deadlines. So I will say, okay, I've got to get this done by this weekend. And often, I do a lot of events and talking at conferences, and I'm often preparing for something today that I'm going to do next week. Because I know I'm not going to have time in between then and now. And I write a weekly column as well, which is something that it constantly hangs over me, because I've got to have an opinion and write 1,000 words every week about something, which is not easy to do. No, it's hard. And I find that you can become quite repetitive in just, the way you write and the phrases that you write and what you're saying and your thoughts about things. So I find that very difficult. So in while I'm writing long form, I've still got to write short form on a weekly basis. And then I've got to write for radio. I write some of the stuff that I say on radio. Most of it's off the cuff, but some of it I do script. So it's about time management. It's about planning. But it's not easy by any means.
Did you foresee this years ago?
No, I didn't. I may not have had children if I had foreseen it.
So you would have kept on writing the books, but you wouldn't have had children. Okay.
Listen, I wouldn't be able to write the books that I wanted to write. I would have had time to write them. I would have taken the risks. I could have spent hours writing. But no, I love my kids, and I'm just in a different phase of my life to what I was then. So it does take a lot more balance, a lot more planning. I was chatting to this friend of mine yesterday, and he said that for the last 6 months, he hasn't been able to go on a family holiday. He hasn't been able to have a braai. He hasn't been able to do anything. He would spend entire weekends writing. And that's what it's like sometimes. My husband wants to kill me at the moment because I'm on my laptop constantly trying to finish this book. And that's the reality of it, is that you've got to just compromise as well.
Yeah. Okay. Just a quick couple of hints for writers. When you go into an interview, if you're up against somebody who's not going to talk to you, what do you do?
What do you mean not talk to you? Like,
if the person is very hesitant, reluctant to speak, have you got techniques for getting through this?
Yeah, talk about something else first. Look, usually what happens is it takes a lot of work before the interview to get them to speak. So it is about building a relationship beforehand. So with a lot of people, I remember some of the whistleblowers, getting them to speak. I spent months and months and months building relationships, trying to convince them, earning trust. And usually it's the work that you do before the interview. If you go into an interview and somebody doesn't want to talk to you, you're not going to get them to talk to you. For me, it's about doing all of the work beforehand to get them to talk to you.
Right. Okay. But you don't go and stick daggers into them if they're reluctant.
No, I'm the opposite. I kill them with kindness.
I'm
not a fighter at all. Like I'm not that kind of journalist that will scream and shout and be dramatic. I'd rather. I think that a lot of people have said to me it's the kind of questions that I ask as well. I ask very open-ended questions. Mm-hmm. So more of a statement that they feel compelled to respond to than a direct yes or no question.
All right. And if you know they're bullshitting you, what do you do then?
Depends. Like sometimes you'll call them out and say, but clearly that's not right. Other times you state the facts and Or you can say, no, you're lying.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mandy, thank you very, very much for your time. I really do.
I think do you want me to answer the couple of questions in the chat?
Well, you kind of have already, but if you've got more points to make, particularly about the kids' books, actually, encourage children to read. I think that's important.
Oh, that's interesting. I had actually spent a lot of my time reading kids' books at the moment because I have small children. And I always think people come up with the best ideas. And my stories are so dark, though. I'm not sure that people would want their children. Although, to be fair, at the moment, I'm doing a lot on whistleblowers, but also just positive stories generally. And I speak about this a lot in the country is alternative narratives that, we tend to fall into the single story of South Africa. But it could be interesting, something different for kids. Yeah, I like that. Any suggestions? Send them to me. Happy to take them on board.
And some ideas for fiction novels, because clearly I'm stuck for ideas. So here's a quick way I can get some ideas.
From me?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. You're thinking of ideas for your own non-fiction books. I think your books are packed with ideas, actually.
So I have this one idea. Tell me what you think about it, all of you. But I'd love to write a book that actually took real news stories that have happened. So the plot lines are all there already because they're true, but then formulating them into a novel, but based on truth. Obviously it's a lot of what you do, Mike, in many ways, but like I'm talking about not actually necessarily completely fictionalizing characters because all of the stuff has happened, but it is a bit out there. I don't know if that would work.
Those are difficult books to write because you sort of go off onto the territory where people can sue you.
So
okay. And one last one here from Michelle, Nancy Drew type book.
Yeah, I think that was the point that Michelle was making earlier about encouraging children to read. I've never even thought about that. That is a good idea. I love if you've got kids, you would have read these, but the Goodnight Stories for Rebel Girls, those kind of books, which look at they're accessible stories about real life heroines. Those are always cool as well. Yeah.
No, I did enjoy that book earlier, a couple of years ago. So Mandy, thank you very much. It's been really nice hearing your side of all these books. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. Yeah, I think, this is the last piece of advice for everyone. I think maybe two things. The first one is keep going. That's the hardest thing, that you reach that point where you just think, no, but everyone has this imposter syndrome. I totally get it, where I think, oh my God, no one's going to read this. Why am I bothering? And the second one is do not delete anything ever. So a lot of people will write a paragraph, think it's shit and delete it. Don't ever delete anything. Keep everything, and rather just write through it, and then afterwards you can edit it.
Okay, well, you're talking to somebody who deletes all the time, so.
I don't delete a thing, ever.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, bye-bye.
Cheers, bye.